The pool was gone by sunrise. Where crystalline water once reflected the morning light, now only a concrete crater remained filled with ash, stone, and the smoldering remnants of Marcus Chen's revenge. Karen Whitfield stood at her kitchen window. She'd called the HOA to destroy his dream. He'd done something far worse. He'd given her exactly what she asked for, and in doing so, had set in motion a chain of events that would tear their perfect suburban neighborhood apart forever. Marcus Chen had always been the kind of neighbor other people pointed to when bragging about their street: quiet, respectful, kept his lawn magazine perfect, never left his trash cans out past pickup day. In the 3 years since he'd moved to Willowbrook Estates, he'd become something of a neighborhood fixture, the guy who'd shovel your driveway without being asked, who'd water your plants when you went on vacation, who'd actually show up when the HOA needed volunteers for the annual block party. So when he finally decided to install the pool, Marcus thought he'd done everything right. He'd submitted the proper paperwork to the HOA, he'd hired licensed contractors, he'd even knocked on doors to let his immediate neighbors know about the construction timeline, apologizing in advance for any inconvenience. Surrounded by tasteful landscaping that complemented the neighborhood's aesthetic. For 6 weeks, Marcus had watched his dream take shape: the excavation, the plumbing, the careful installation of the liner. Every evening after work, he'd stand at his back door with a beer, imagining summer barbecues, his sister's kids splashing around during their visits, maybe even hosting the annual HOA pool party he'd been hearing about for years. The pool was filled and ready on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, Karen Whitfield had already made her first call to the HOA board. Marcus discovered this when he came home from work to find a certified letter wedged between his storm door and front door. The thick cream envelope bore the Willowbrook Estates HOA seal, and Marcus's stomach dropped as he recognized the formal weight of official correspondence. Inside, the language was clinical and devastating. Asterisk, Dear Mr. Chen, it has been brought to the attention of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association Board that a pool installation has been completed on your property without proper approval. Please be advised that this installation is in violation of HOA Covenant 14.7b regarding major landscaping modifications and aesthetic standards. Compliance. Asterisk, Marcus read the letter 3 times, his hands growing steadier with each pass, as confusion gave way to indignation. He'd submitted every form, paid every fee, received written approval 6 months ago. He had the paperwork upstairs in his home office, filed away with obsessive care in a folder labeled Pool Project, approved. But, as he continued reading, the letter's real message became clear. Someone the letter didn't specify who had filed a formal complaint alleging that his pool violated the neighborhood's visual harmony standards and created excessive noise and potential safety hazards. The letter concluded with a demand. Marcus had 30 days to either bring the installation into compliance with unspecified additional requirements or remove it entirely. Marcus stood in his driveway for a long moment, the letter crumpling slightly. In his grip, across the street, Karen Whitfield's pristine white colonial gleamed in the afternoon sun, its windows reflecting the light like watchful eyes. Her prized rose garden bordered the sidewalk, each bloom positioned with mathematical precision. Her lawn was always exactly 2.5 inches high, Marcus knew, because he'd once overheard her instructing her lawn service with the dedication of a golf course superintendent. Karen had lived in Willowbrook Estates for 12 years, serving on the HOA board for 8 of them. She was the kind of neighbor who noticed when your newspaper landed 3 inches too far to the left, who could tell you the exact day your mailbox would need repainting, who somehow always knew when garbage day had been moved due to holidays before anyone else got the memo. She was also standing in her front yard, pruning shears in hand, watching him with the focused attention of a hawk spotting movement in tall grass. Marcus folded the letter and walked across the street. Karen, he said, stopping at the edge of her driveway, I think there's been some kind of mistake with the HOA. She didn't look up from her roses, but her pruning became more deliberate. Oh, what kind of mistake? I got a letter today about my pool. They're saying it wasn't properly approved, but I have all the paperwork. I followed every rule, paid every fee. Marcus pulled out his phone, scrolling to the photos he'd taken of his approval documents. Look, I can show you, Marcus. Karen's voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining something to a child. She finally looked up, her pale blue eyes meeting his with uncomfortable directness. "The board received multiple complaints about your pool installation." "Multiple complaints? About what?" "Potential property value, impact." She clipped another rose with surgical precision. "Safety concerns regarding proper fencing and chemical storage." Marcus felt heat rising in his chest. "I hired licensed contractors. The installation meets all county codes. The fencing exceeds HOA requirements by 6 inches. And what aesthetic disruption? You can barely see the pool from the street." "That's not entirely true." Karen set down her pruning shears and faced him fully. "The pool equipment is visible from several neighbors' upper windows. The sound of the filtration system carries, especially at night. And the lighting you installed creates an unnecessary glow that affects the natural ambience of our community." Each word was delivered with the calm authority of someone who'd clearly rehearsed this conversation. Marcus realized with growing certainty that Karen hadn't just filed one complaint, she'd filed them all. "Karen, why didn't you talk to me first? If there were issues, I could have addressed them. I'm not unreasonable. I did consider that." She picked up her pruning shears again, examining a particularly full bloom. "But frankly, Marcus, this is bigger than just neighbor relations. This is about maintaining the standards that make Willowbrook Estates special. When people buy homes here, they're buying into a certain lifestyle, a certain aesthetic vision. We can't have residents making major modifications that compromise that vision, even if they technically meet minimum requirements." The reasonableness of her tone made the words even more infuriating. "So what are you saying? That I need to tear out a pool I spent $20,000 on because it doesn't match your vision?" "I'm saying that sometimes being a good neighbor means making sacrifices for the greater good of the community." Karen's voice softened slightly, as if she were genuinely trying to be helpful. "I'm sure you could recoup some of your costs. Pool removal isn't as expensive as installation. And think about it, do you really want to be the neighbor who fights the HOA? That never ends well for anyone." Marcus stared at her, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. This wasn't about noise or aesthetics or property values. This was about power, about Karen Whitfield reminding everyone in Willowbrook Estates exactly who set the rules and who enforced them. "I see," he said quietly. "I hope you do." Karen turned back to her roses. "The board meets next Thursday if you want to present your case. But honestly, Marcus, I'd recommend focusing your energy on finding a good pool removal company. It'll save everyone a lot of unpleasantness." Marcus walked back across the street, the HOA letter feeling heavier in his pocket with each step. Behind him, he could hear the steady snip of Karen's pruning shears, methodical and relentless. That evening, Marcus sat on his back deck with a beer and his laptop, staring at his pool. The underwater lights cast gentle blue ripples across the water's surface, and the quiet hum of the filtration system provided a soothing background rhythm. It was everything he'd imagined, everything he'd worked for. He opened his laptop and began researching HOA law, pool removal costs, and property rights. But as he scrolled through legal precedents and contractor estimates, another idea began to form, one that made him close the laptop and lean back in his chair with something that might have been a smile. Karen Whitfield had spent 12 years teaching Willowbrook Estates about the importance of following rules. Maybe it was time someone taught her that rules could cut both ways. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until, "Hey Dave, it's Marcus Chen. Yeah, the pool's great, thanks. Listen, I need to ask you something. That demolition equipment you mentioned, during the build, how quickly could you get it back here?" Dave Morrison arrived at 6:47 a.m. on Saturday morning, his pickup truck pulling a trailer loaded with pumps, hoses, and what looked like enough equipment to drain Lake Michigan. Marcus had been awake since 5, sitting on his back deck with coffee and a stack of documents that represented 3 months of meticulous research. "You sure about this, Marcus?" Dave asked, unloading the first pump. He was a weathered man in his 50s who'd built pools for 20 years and had seen his share of homeowner regrets. "Once we drain her, that's a lot of water down the storm. Drain and refilling ain't cheap, I'm sure." Marcus held up a folder thick with printouts. "Trust me, I've done my homework." What Marcus had discovered during his late-night research sessions would have impressed a law student. Willowbrook Estates' HOA covenants were a maze of contradictions, grandfather clauses and loopholes that had accumulated over 3 decades of amendments and board changes. More importantly, he'd found something Karen Whitfield had apparently missed in her zeal to destroy his pool, Section 23.4c, buried on page 67 of the covenant document. Fire features were explicitly permitted without board approval, provided they met county fire codes and were constructed in areas previously designated for recreational water features. Marcus had called the county fire marshal's office on Thursday. A very helpful inspector named Rodriguez had walked him through the requirements for residential fire pits. Concrete pad, check his pool deck would work perfectly. Proper clearances from structures. Check his pool was positioned exactly where the fire pit would need to be. Gas line accessibility, check the pool heater's gas connection could be easily rerouted. All you need is a permit and an inspection, Rodriguez had said. Shouldn't be more than a week turnaround if your paperwork's in order. The paperwork was very much in order. As Dave's pumps roared to life, Marcus walked across the street to collect his mail. The morning was crisp and quiet, the kind of suburban Saturday where most neighbors were still in bathrobes reading the paper, but Karen Whitfield was already in her front yard, deadheading petunias with the focused intensity of someone performing surgery. She looked up as Marcus approached his mailbox, her eyes immediately darting to the noise coming from his backyard. "Starting early today, aren't you?" "Just taking care of some maintenance," Marcus replied cheerfully. "Hope the noise isn't bothering you. What kind of maintenance requires that much equipment?" Marcus pulled a stack of mail from his box, sorting through it with deliberate casualness. "Oh, you know how it is. Sometimes you have to make changes to keep everyone happy." He looked up and smiled. "I'm sure you understand." Karen's pruning shears paused mid-clip. Something in Marcus's tone had shifted, and she was smart enough to recognize the change even if she couldn't identify it yet. "Changes? Well, you were right about the pool. After thinking about what you said, I realized it really wasn't fitting with the neighborhood's character." Marcus folded his mail and tucked it under his arm. "So, I'm addressing the situation." The sound of rushing water grew louder as Dave's pumps hit full capacity. Karen's head turned toward Marcus's backyard, where she could now see streams of chlorinated water cascading down his driveway toward the storm drain. "You single quote, draining your pool." Among other things, Marcus started walking back to his house, then paused and turned around. "Oh, and Karen, thank you for helping me see that sometimes being a good neighbor means making sacrifices for the greater good of the community." That was really insightful. He left her standing there, pruning shears forgotten in her hand. As 20,000 gallons of water thundered down the street, by noon, half the neighborhood had found reasons to walk past Marcus's house. The pool was nearly empty, revealing the stark concrete shell that had been hidden beneath the blue surface. Dave and his crew had arrived with additional equipment: jackhammers, concrete saws, and a small excavator that they'd driven through Marcus's side gate. "What's he doing over there?" Susan Martinez asked her husband as they stood at their living room window. Their house was 2 doors down from Marcus, with a clear view of the chaos unfolding in his backyard. "Looks like he's tearing out the whole thing," Roberto replied, adjusting his glasses. Karen must have really gotten to him, but Susan wasn't so sure. She'd watched Marcus Chen for 3 years, and he'd never struck her as the type to cave under pressure. If anything, he was methodical to a fault, the kind of person who read instruction manuals cover to cover and kept digital copies of all his receipts. This felt less like capitulation and more like ... preparation. "I'm going to take him some lemonade," she announced. "Susan, don't get involved in whatever this is." "I'm not getting involved. I'm being neighborly." She found Marcus standing in his backyard, watching Dave's crew break up the concrete pool steps with surgical precision. The scene looked like controlled demolition, every cut calculated, every piece of debris carefully sorted and staged. "Thought you might be thirsty," Susan said, offering him a tall glass. "That's very kind of you." Marcus accepted the lemonade gratefully. His work clothes were dusty, but not dirty. He was clearly supervising rather than participating in the demolition. "So," Susan said carefully, "this is quite a project." "It is." Marcus took a long drink. "But sometimes you have to tear something down before you can build something better." "Building something better?" Marcus smiled, and Susan noticed he looked more relaxed than she'd seen him in weeks. "Fire pit, custom design, built into the existing concrete pad, should be ready in time for the 4th of July. Susan blinked. Fire pit, county approved, fully permitted, natural gas feed, proper ventilation, seating for 12. Marcus gestured toward the destruction with obvious satisfaction. Karen was right, the pool didn't fit the neighborhood character, but a fire pit that's going to bring the whole community together. As if summoned by her name, Karen Whitfield appeared at Marcus's side gate. She'd clearly been pacing her front yard for hours, trying to build up the courage to investigate directly. "Marcus," she called out, her voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" "Of course, Karen." "Susan, thanks for the lemonade." Susan retreated to a respectful distance, but remained within earshot, suddenly very interested in examining Marcus's tomato plants. Karen stepped into the backyard, her eyes sweeping over the demolition site with growing alarm. "Marcus, what exactly are you doing?" "I'm following your advice. Making sacrifices for the greater good of the community." "This isn't what I meant, and you know it." Marcus set down his lemonade and pulled a folder from a nearby lawn chair. "Actually, Karen, I think this is exactly what you meant. You said I should focus on maintaining the standards that make Willowbrook Estates special. You said I should think about the lifestyle and aesthetic vision people are buying into when they move here." He opened the folder and handed her a document. "So, I did some research into what our community really values. Turns out, according to the original HOA covenants from 1987, Willowbrook Estates was designed as a family-oriented community, emphasizing outdoor recreation and neighborly gathering spaces." Karen scanned the document, her face growing paler with each line. "This is from the original charter. These provisions have been superseded." "Actually, no, they haven't." Marcus handed her another document. "I checked with the county registrar. Amendments can add restrictions, but they can't override the fundamental charter unless they're explicitly designed to do so. And none of the subsequent amendments mention recreational gathering spaces." "Marcus, what are you trying to say?" "I'm saying that my pool was actually perfectly in line with the community's original vision. But since you felt it didn't promote neighborly gathering, I'm replacing it with something that will." Marcus smiled broadly. "A fire pit encourages community interaction in a way a pool never could. It's family-friendly, aesthetically pleasing, and creates exactly the kind of outdoor recreation space the founders envisioned." Karen looked around. The demolished backyard, understanding finally dawning. "You can't build a fire pit here without board approval." "Actually, I can." Marcus handed her a third document, Section 23.4c. "Fire features are pre-approved for any area previously designated for recreational water features. Provided they meet county fire codes." He gestured toward Dave, who was now installing what looked like gas lines. "My permit was approved yesterday. Inspection is scheduled for Monday." That section applies to existing fire features, not new construction. The section doesn't specify existing versus new. I had a lawyer review the language. Marcus's voice remained friendly, conversational. "Turns out, when the board wrote these covenants, they were very thorough about some things and surprisingly vague about others." Karen clutched the documents, her knuckles white. "The board will never approve this." "The board doesn't need to approve it. It's pre-approved." Marcus pulled out his phone and showed her a photo. "This is the artist's rendering. Natural stone surround, built-in seating, decorative lighting. It's going to be beautiful, Karen. A real centerpiece for community gatherings." "Community gatherings?" "Oh yes. I'm planning to host the annual HOA summer meeting right here. Instead of renting the community center, we can have it in my backyard around the fire pit. More intimate, more in keeping The fire pit was magnificent. Marcus had spared no expense on the design natural fieldstone arranged in a perfect circle, surrounded by built-in curved seating that could accommodate 15 people comfortably. The flames danced from a custom gas ring hidden beneath decorative lava rocks, creating an ambience that was both primitive and sophisticated. Soft landscape lighting illuminated the seating area without creating the harsh glare Karen had complained about with his pool lights. 2 weeks after the pool's destruction, Marcus hosted his first gathering. "I can't believe you actually did." It laughed Jenny Rodriguez, the county fire inspector who'd become an unexpected ally during the permit process. She sat with her husband Tom, both of them holding craft beers and watching the flames flicker against the evening sky. "When you called about that fire pit permit, I thought you were just another suburban dad trying to one-up his neighbors." "Oh, he definitely is," said Dave Morrison, settling into the seat beside them. "But he's also the smartest suburban dad I've ever worked with." He raised his beer toward Marcus. "This whole setup is brilliant. Man, you've got, what, 8 people here tonight?" "9, Marcus corrected, nodding toward Susan Martinez, who was deep in conversation with Dr. Patricia Wells from 3 houses down. And this is just the beginning. The gathering had started organically. Marcus had mentioned to Susan that he was testing out the fire pit, and she'd asked if she could bring her husband, Roberto. Word had spread through the neighborhoods. Informal networked the dog walkers, the evening joggers, the parents who congregated at the bus stop each morning. Within a week, Marcus had a list of neighbors who'd expressed interest in joining what had become known as Marcus's Friday Fire Nights. "It's like having a campfire without having to leave civilization," said Patricia, accepting a fresh glass of wine from Marcus. She was a retired psychiatrist who'd moved to Willowbrook Estates 5 years ago, and she'd become something of a neighborhood confessor for people dealing with HOA disputes. "There's something primal about gathering around a fire. It breaks down social barriers." Roberto Martinez nodded enthusiastically. "My kids keep asking when they can come to one of these. My youngest wants to roast marshmallows." "Next Friday," Marcus said immediately. "Family night. I'll get supplies for some hot dogs, the whole deal." He paused, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Actually, that gives me an idea. Patricia, you mentioned that the Hendersons on Oak Street are having issues with their deck renovation approval. The board rejected their plans twice, claiming the railing design doesn't match the neighborhood aesthetic standards. Bring them next Friday. I'd like to meet them." Jenny Rodriguez looked at Marcus with growing curiosity. "You're collecting people, aren't you?" "I'm building community," Marcus replied carefully. Exactly what Karen said this neighborhood needed. What he didn't mention was the notebook he kept inside his house, filled with detailed notes about every HOA complaint, dispute, and power play that had occurred in Willowbrook Estates over the past 5 years. Patricia had been an invaluable source of information. Neighbors had confided in her about everything from fence height disputes to mailbox color violations. Each story followed the same pattern. A resident would make a reasonable request. Karen would find a reason to object or delay, and eventually the homeowner would either capitulate or move away. The Hendersons were just the latest casualties, but Marcus suspected they might also be his most valuable allies. As the evening wound down and neighbors began heading home, Marcus noticed a familiar figure standing at her kitchen window across the street. Karen had been watching the gathering for the past hour, her silhouette framed by her bright kitchen lights. "She's been keeping track," Susan observed, following Marcus's gaze, "taking notes from the look of it." "Good," Marcus said quietly. "Let her take all the notes she wants." The next morning, Marcus found exactly what he'd expected in his mailbox: another certified letter from the HOA board. Asterisk, "Dear Mr. Chen, it has been brought to the board's attention that you are hosting regular gatherings on your property that may constitute commercial entertainment activities in violation of HOA Covenant 18.2 regarding home-based businesses. Additionally, concerns have been raised about noise levels, parking impacts, and potential liability issues. ... Asterisk, Marcus read the letter twice, then walked directly to his computer and began typing. His response was a masterpiece of bureaucratic jujitsu. Asterisk, "Dear board members, thank you for your concern regarding my community building activities. I appreciate the board's commitment to ensuring all residents comply with our HOA covenants. Per your request, I have thoroughly reviewed Covenant 18.2a regarding home-based businesses. You'll be pleased to know that my gatherings fully comply with all stated requirements, as they are non-commercial in nature, no fees charged, no services sold, limited to neighborhood residents only, conducted within approved outdoor recreational space consistent with the community's founding charter, emphasizing neighborly gathering spaces regarding noise concerns. All activities conclude by 9 p.m. in compliance with county ordinances. As for parking, I've enclosed photos showing that all attendees park in their own driveways or designated street parking, creating no impact on traffic flow. Finally, regarding liability issues, I want to assure the board that I carry comprehensive homeowners insurance that covers social gatherings. My insurance agent has confirmed that my policy exceeds the minimum coverage requirements outlined in our HOA master policy. I hope this addresses the board's concerns. Please don't hesitate to contact me if you need any additional documentation. In the spirit of community cooperation, I'd like to extend a personal invitation to all board members to attend next Friday's family gathering. I believe experiencing our community building efforts firsthand would help the board understand how these activities support our neighborhood's values. Sincerely, Marcus Chen *. He printed the letter, had it notarized at the bank, and sent it certified mail the same day. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. Normally, these meetings were sparsely attended. Two other board members, and maybe one or two residents with specific complaints. This time, Marcus had encouraged everyone from his fire pit gatherings to attend. The meeting was held in the community center's main room, a bland space with fluorescent lighting and folding chairs arranged in neat rows. Karen sat at a folding table at the front, flanked by board members Eric Hoffman and Margaret Torres. She looked distinctly uncomfortable as residents filed in more people than had attended a board meeting in years. First item on the agenda, Karen announced, consulting her notes, is the matter of unauthorized gathering activities at 1247 Maple Street. Marcus stood up from the front row. I believe there's been some confusion, Karen, as I outlined in my letter. These gatherings are fully authorized under our existing covenants. The board has concerns about the frequency and scope of these activities. What concerns specifically? Dr. Patricia Wells asked from the middle of the room. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. I've attended several of Marcus's gatherings, and they seem exactly like the kind of community building our neighborhood has been missing. That's not the point, Karen replied, her composure slipping slightly. The point is that regular gatherings require board oversight to ensure they don't become disruptive. Disruptive to what? Jenny Rodriguez stood up, still wearing her county inspector's uniform from work. I live 4 blocks away, and I've been to Marcus's fire pit nights. They're quieter than most backyard barbecues. Roberto Martinez raised his hand. My kids walk by Marcus's house every day. They've never seen anything but neighbors sitting around talking. How is that disruptive? Karen looked around the room, suddenly realizing that she was facing not just Marcus, but a coalition of neighbors who'd found something they'd been missing without knowing it. The board has a responsibility to maintain order. The board has a responsibility to serve the community, interrupted a voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned to see David Henderson, a tall man in his 40s, who'd moved to Willowbrook Estates 6 months ago with his wife and twin daughters. And from what I've seen, Marcus is doing more to serve this community than the board has done in years. Karen's face flushed red. Mr. Henderson, if you have complaints about board governance, there are proper channels, like the proper channels my wife and I have been trying to use for 3 months to get approval for our deck railing. David's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. The proper channels that keep finding new problems with our plans every time we address the previous concerns. Margaret Torres, the board treasurer, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The Henderson renovation has raised some complex aesthetic considerations. What's complex about replacing rotted deck railings with identical railings? David pulled out a folder thick with documents. I have emails showing that our first submission was rejected because the rail spacing was allegedly too wide. Our second submission was rejected because the proposed stain color was supposedly too dark. Our third submission, which addressed both previous concerns, was rejected because now the railing height might create visual discontinuity with N. The email arrived in Marcus's inbox at 11:47 p.m. on Friday night. Sent from an address he didn't recognize, willowbrookreform@protonmail.com. Asterisk, Marcus, thank you for what you did at the board meeting. My husband and I have been documenting behavior for 2 years, but we never knew how many other people were affected. Would you be interested in seeing what we've collected? Best regards, a concerned neighbor. Asterisk. Marcus stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back a single word. Yes. The response came within minutes, containing a link to a shared drive folder titled HOA Accountability Project. When Marcus opened it, he found himself looking at the most comprehensive documentation of bureaucratic abuse he'd ever seen. The anonymous neighbors, he suspected it was the Hendersons, but couldn't be certain, had been busy. The folder contained screenshots of email exchanges, scanned copies of rejection letters, photographs of approved and rejected projects side by side, and a detailed timeline of board decisions going back 3 years. Most damning of all was a spreadsheet showing the correlation between project approval rates and homeowner compliance with Karen's unofficial suggestions. Residents who hired Karen's preferred contractors, 94% approval rate. Residents who used landscaping services from Karen's recommended list, 89% approval rate. Residents who challenged board decisions or asked for written justification, 23% approval rate. Marcus spent 2 hours reviewing the documents, his anger growing with each page. This wasn't just petty tyranny, it was systematic corruption. Karen had turned the HOA into her personal kingdom, complete with financial kickbacks and retribution against anyone who dared question her authority. The next morning brought another surprise. Suzanne Martinez at his front door, holding a manila folder and looking uncharacteristically serious. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. They sat at Marcus's kitchen table, while Susan spread out a collection of documents that mirrored the anonymous folder he'd received the night before. "How long have you known?" Marcus asked. "Suspected for about a year. Knew for certain after the board meeting Thursday night." Susan pulled out a photograph showing Karen shaking hands with a man in a contractor's uniform outside the community center. "This is Rick Brennan. He owns Brennan Landscaping, does work for about 60% of the houses in Willowbrook Estates. Let me guess, he's on Karen's approved vendor list. He is now, but 18 months ago, he was just another landscaping contractor trying to drum up business in the neighborhood." Susan showed him another photo, this one clearly taken with a telephoto lens. "This is Karen and Rick having lunch at Chez Laurent downtown. Not the kind of place you go for a casual business meeting." Marcus studied the image. Karen and the contractor were sitting close together, leaning across the table in conversation that looked far more intimate than professional. "You think they're having an affair?" "I think they have an arrangement that goes beyond landscaping." Recommendations. Susan pulled out a bank statement printout. "This is from the HOA's General Maintenance Fund. Notice the payments to Brennan Landscaping for emergency common area repairs. That, coincidentally, always happen right after Karen rejects someone's private renovation project." The pattern was undeniable. A homeowner would submit plans for landscaping. Work Karen would reject them for aesthetic concerns. Within days, the HOA would hire Brennan Landscaping for work on common areas that happened to be visible from the rejected project site. The homeowner, seeing the approved aesthetic, would often hire Brennan to redo their own project to match. "She's running a racket," Marcus said quietly. "She's running several rackets: landscaping, painting, even mailbox replacements." Susan closed the folder. "The question is, what do we do about it?" Before Marcus could answer, his doorbell rang. Through the front window, he could see David Henderson standing on his porch, holding what appeared to be a briefcase. "I think our question just got answered," Marcus said, getting up to open the door. David entered the kitchen and stopped short. When he saw Susan's documents spread across the table, "So you've seen it too." "Seen what, exactly?" Marcus asked. David opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder labeled Financial Analysis. "Willowbrook Estates, HOA. I'm a forensic accountant. After Thursday's meeting, I decided to do some digging into the HOA's financial records. They're required to be available to homeowners upon request." He spread out a series of charts and spreadsheets that made Susan's documentation look amateur by comparison. Over the past 3 years, the HOA has spent $147,000 on emergency maintenance and aesthetic compliance projects. Want to guess how much of that went to companies owned by people who happened to be close to Karen Whitfield? "How much?" Susan asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer would be infuriating. 83%. And that's just the obvious connections. If I had more time to trace shell companies and business partnerships, I suspect the percentage would be even higher. Marcus sat back down, feeling the weight of what they'd uncovered. "This isn't just about my pool anymore." "It never was," David replied. "Your pool was just the latest example of a system that's been broken for years. Karen has turned the into her personal piggy bank. And she's been using covenant enforcement as a way to pressure residents into using her network of preferred vendors." Susan leaned forward. So what's our next move? File a complaint with the county? Contact a lawyer? We could do that, David said slowly. But legal action takes time, and it's expensive. Karen has been very careful to keep her activities within the gray areas of the law. Most of what she's doing is technically legal, just massively unethical. Marcus thought about the anonymous email from the night before, about the dozen hands raised at the board meeting, about the growing collection of neighbors who'd been gathering around his fire pit every Friday night. What if we didn't need lawyers? What do you mean? The board serves at the pleasure of the homeowners. The next annual election is in October, 3 months away. All we need is a majority of residents to vote for new leadership. David nodded. Slowly, a slate of reform candidates. Run on transparency and accountability. Exactly. And we already have a built-in campaign organization. Marcus gestured toward his backyard, where the fire pit was visible through the kitchen window. Every Friday night, we've been building a coalition of people who are tired of Karen's games. We just need to turn that coalition into a voting bloc. Susan looked skeptical. You think you can get enough people to vote against Karen? She's been in power for 8 years. People are used to her. People are used to being afraid of her, Marcus corrected. But Thursday night showed us something important. When neighbors stand together, Karen's power disappears. She couldn't shut down David's complaints when he had a room full of witnesses. She couldn't dismiss the raised hands when 12 families confirmed the same pattern of abuse. David was already pulling out his phone. I can put together a presentation of the financial irregularities, something that makes the corruption undeniable. And I can reach out to the people I know have been affected, Susan added. There are more victims than just the ones who came to the meeting. Marcus felt the familiar satisfaction he'd experienced when draining his pool and outmaneuvering Karen's first attack. But this was bigger than personal revenge now. This was about transforming a community that had been held hostage by one person's ego and greed. There's something else, he said, pulling out his phone and showing them the anonymous email from the night before. We're not the only ones who've been documenting Karen's behavior. Someone else has been building a case for 2 years. By the time they finished planning, they had the skeleton of a campaign that would have impressed a political operative. David would handle the financial forensics and formal complaint process. Susan would organize the neighborhood outreach and voter registration. Marcus would continue hosting the Friday night gatherings, but now with a specific agenda, building the coalition that would vote Karen Whitfield out of power. As his co-conspirators left that afternoon, Marcus walked out to his fire pit and stood looking at the stone circle that had replaced his pool. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the seating area, and he could already envision Friday night's gathering bigger than before, more focused, more purposeful. He pulled out his phone and composed a group text to everyone who'd been attending the fire pit nights. Friday night fire pit gathering moved to 6 p.m. Special presentation on HOA transparency and October elections. Bring a friend. Time to take back our neighborhood. The responses started coming in immediately. People who'd been silent for years suddenly had something to say, and they were saying it loudly. Marcus counted the confirmations. 18 people, plus guests. Karen Whitfield had no idea what was coming for her, but she was about to find out that the fire she'd tried to extinguish had become something much bigger and more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. The revolution would be held around a fire pit, and it would be neighborly as hell. The meeting that changed everything happened on a Tuesday afternoon in September, 3 weeks before the election. Marcus was in his backyard, adjusting the gas flow on the fire pit in preparation for that evening's campaign strategy session, when he heard voices from Karen's front yard, loud voices, angry voices, angry voices. One of them definitely belonged to Karen, but the other was an unfamiliar man's voice, rough with frustration and what sounded like barely controlled rage. Marcus moved closer to his side fence, staying hidden behind his garden shed, but within earshot of the confrontation. Told you this needed to stop weeks ago, the man was saying. Now I've got county inspectors crawling all over my job sites, asking questions about HOA contracts and competitive bidding processes. Rick, calm down. Karen's voice was strained, missing its usual commanding tone. It's just routine, my ass, Karen. Someone's been feeding them information. Detailed information. They know about the maintenance contracts, the emergency, repair authorizations, Even the fucking lunch meetings. Rick Brennan's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. They know about us. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. He pulled out his phone and started recording. There's nothing illegal about our business relationship, Karen said, but even from 30 feet away, Marcus could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Business relationship, Rick laughed bitterly. Is that what we're calling it now? Because the county inspector seemed real interested in our business lunches at the Marriott last month. Keep your voice down. Don't tell me to keep my voice down. I've got 3 kids and a mortgage. Karen, if this goes sideways, I lose everything. You understand that? Everything. There was a long pause, and when Karen spoke again, her voice had taken on the cold, calculating tone Marcus remembered from their confrontations about his pool. Nothing is going sideways, Rick. We just need to weather this until after the election. Once the board votes confirm our current leadership, all of this dies down. And what if your little slate of reformers wins? What then? They won't win. Karen's confidence was returning. I've been talking to residents all week. People don't like change, Rick. They especially don't like change pushed by troublemakers like Marcus Chen. When voters actually think about it, they'll stick with experience and stability. Marcus almost laughed out loud. If Karen had been talking to residents all week, she'd apparently missed the part where 3/4 of them were now attending his fire pit meetings. Besides, Karen continued, I have a few surprises planned for Mr. Chen and his little coalition. You'd be amazed what you can find when you really start looking into someone's background. The threat was unmistakable, and Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the September air. He kept recording as Rick and Karen's conversation moved toward the street, their voices fading as they walked toward Rick's truck. That evening's fire pit gathering was the largest yet. 26 people crowded around the flames, including several faces Marcus hadn't seen before. The anonymous emailer had finally revealed themselves, Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation. Despite the shared surname, a data analyst who'd moved to Willowbrook Estates 18 months ago and had been systematically documenting HOA irregularities. Ever since, I know this sounds paranoid, she said, addressing the group from her seat on the stone bench. But I think we need to be prepared for Karen to fight dirty as we get closer to the election. How dirty? David Henderson asked. He'd been running as the reform candidate for board president, with Susan Martinez and Dr. Patricia Wells rounding out their slate. I've been monitoring the HOA's email communications, which, as a homeowner, I have every right to do. Karen's been reaching out to a private investigation firm about vetting potential board candidates for the safety and security of the community. Marcus felt his stomach drop. She's having us investigated. She's having all of us investigated. Background checks, financial records, social media histories, employment verification. The works. Susan leaned forward. Can she do that? Legally. Maybe the HOA covenants are vague about what constitutes due diligence for board candidates. Sarah pulled out a tablet and scrolled through what appeared to be legal documents. Ethically, it's a massive overreach designed to intimidate residents. From participating in the democratic process, Marcus thought about the recording on his phone, about Rick Brennan's panic and Karen's casual mention of surprises. There's something else you all need to know. He played the audio from that afternoon, watching his neighbors' faces grow more alarmed with each revelation. When it finished, the circle around the fire pit was completely silent except for the soft hiss of the gas flames. Holy shit, Roberto Martinez whispered. She's not just corrupt, she's desperate. Desperate people do desperate things, Patricia Wells observed. If Karen's willing to hire private investigators to dig up dirt on board candidates, what else is she willing to do? David stood up and began pacing around the fire pit. This actually might work in our favor. If we can prove she's using HOA funds to hire investigators for personal political purposes, that's a clear violation of fiduciary duty. It might even be criminal. How do we prove it? Susan asked. Sarah smiled grimly. Leave that to me. I've been tracking HOA expenditures for months. If Karen pays for these investigations through the HOA account, I'll know within 24 hours. Marcus looked around the circle at his neighbors' people, who 3 months ago had been strangers. United now by shared frustration and a common purpose. They'd started as victims of Karen's petty tyranny, but they'd evolved into something more dangerous to her regime, an organized opposition with documentation, legal expertise, and most importantly, the numbers to win. There's something else. "We need to discuss," he said. Karen threatened to dig into my background specifically. "I want you all to know what she's going to find, so there are no surprises." The group waited as Marcus gathered his thoughts. This was the conversation he'd been dreading since the campaign began. 5 years ago, before I moved here, I was involved in a lawsuit against my previous HOA. It was similar to what's happening here: board corruption, financial irregularities, retaliation against residents who asked questions. Marcus met each person's eyes as he spoke. I won that lawsuit. The board was removed, criminal charges were filed against 2 members, and the HOA had to pay significant damages to affected homeowners. The silence stretched for several seconds before David started laughing. "You're kidding me! Karen's trying to discredit you by revealing that you've successfully fought HOA corruption before. That's like trying to disqualify a surgeon by pointing out they've performed surgery before," Patricia added. "It gets better," Marcus continued. "The lawsuit resulted in new state legislation about HOA transparency and accountability. I testified before the state legislature about the need for homeowner protections. That testimony is part of the public record." Sarah was already pulling up her tablet. What was the legislation called? The Homeowner Protection and Transparency Act of 2019. Sarah's eyes widened as she read, "Marcus, this law requires HOAs to provide detailed financial disclosures, creates criminal penalties for board member self-dealing, and establishes a state oversight commission for HOA disputes." She looked up at him with something approaching awe. "You helped write the law that makes everything Karen's been doing prosecutable." The mood around the fire pit shifted from concern to excitement. Marcus's supposed vulnerability had just become their nuclear weapon. "So when Karen tries to attack you for being a troublemaker," Roberto said slowly, "you can respond by pointing out that you helped pass the law she's been breaking for 3 years. And when she tries to claim you're biased against HOAs," Susan added, "you can point out that you only fight corrupt HOAs, not legitimate ones." David was grinning broadly. "This is perfect. Karen's about to hand us the election by trying to smear you with your greatest qualification." Marcus felt the familiar satisfaction, but this time it was mixed with something deeper, a sense of justice that went beyond personal revenge. Karen had spent 3 years terrorizing his neighbors, stealing from the community, and abusing her power. In trying to destroy him, she was about to expose herself to laws specifically designed to stop people like her. "There's one more thing," Marcus said, pulling out his phone again. "I think it's time we contacted the State HOA Oversight Commission about what we've discovered here." Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "I can have a formal complaint filed by tomorrow morning, complete with all our documentation, and I can have the financial analysis ready for investigators by the end of the week," David added. Marcus looked around the fire pit one more time at the faces of neighbors who'd become friends and friends who'd become allies. 3 months ago, he'd been a man who just wanted to enjoy his backyard pool. Now he was leading a community uprising that was about to bring down a corrupt regime. The irony was perfect. Karen had tried to destroy his pool to demonstrate her power. Instead, she'd created the gathering place where her own destruction had been planned. To the fire pit, Patricia Wells said, raising her wineglass toward the flames, "The best thing that ever happened to Willowbrook Estates." As his neighbors echoed the toast, Marcus smiled and thought about how much he was going to enjoy Election day arrived with a kind of crisp October morning that made suburbanites feel optimistic about democracy. Marcus stood in his backyard at 6 a.m., watching the sunrise reflect off the stone surface of his fire pit, and marveled at how much had changed since that first angry evening when he'd drained his pool. The voting wouldn't start until noon, but Marcus's phone had been buzzing since dawn with updates from his coalition. Sarah Chen had stationed herself at the community center with her laptop, ready to monitor the electronic voting system for irregularities. David Henderson was coordinating rides for elderly residents who might have trouble getting to the polls. Susan Martinez had organized a phone tree to remind every registered voter in their network about the election. It was going to be the highest voter turnout in Willowbrook Estates history. At 11:47 a.m., Marcus's doorbell rang. Holding a manila folder and wearing an expression he'd never seen before, something that might have been desperation masquerading as confidence. "Marcus," she said, her voice carefully modulated, "I wonder if we could have a private conversation before the voting begins." "Of course. Karen, come in." She followed him to the kitchen, declining his offer of coffee and sitting rigidly in the same chair where David Henderson had first spread out his financial analysis 3 months ago. "I think we can find a way forward that benefits everyone." Marcus sat across from her, maintaining the same polite demeanor he'd perfected during their months of conflict. "I'm listening. I've had some time to reflect on our disagreements, and I realize that perhaps I was too... zealous in my interpretation of the HOA covenants." A document across the table. Marcus read it carefully, his eyebrows rising with each paragraph. "Along with an offer to reimburse my costs for the removal and fire pit installation of the technical requirements." Marcus set the document down and looked at Karen with genuine curiosity. "What do you want in return?" "I want you to withdraw from the election, publicly endorse the current board for continuity and stability, use your ... influence to encourage your supporters to do the same." The silence stretched between them for nearly a minute. Marcus could hear the sound of cars pulling into the community center parking lot across the neighborhood. Early voters arriving for the most consequential election in Willowbrook Estates history. "Karen," he said finally, "do you remember what you told me the day I got your first letter about the pool?" She shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not sure I follow. You said that sometimes being a good neighbor means making sacrifices for the greater good of the community?" Marcus leaned forward slightly. "You were right about that, just not in the way you intended." "Marcus, I'm trying to find a reasonable solution here. The reasonable solution already exists. Strategy. For 3 years, you turned this HOA into your personal kingdom. You stole from your neighbors. You terrorized people who disagreed with you." He turned back to Karen, who was now clutching her folder like a shield. "The greater good of this community requires that you face consequences for what you've done." Karen's carefully constructed composure finally cracked. "It's about making hard decisions that people don't like. It's about maintaining property values and neighborhood standards when residents would rather do whatever they please. That's why we need board members with integrity instead of board members with kickback schemes." Karen's face went white and sat down, his voice gentle but implacable. "The financial irregularities, the vendor relationships, the private investigators you hired with HOA funds to dig up dirt on your political opponents? That's not Taineva. We have documentation. Karen, financial records, audio recordings, witness statements. We have something you never understood. We have a community that's tired of being afraid of its own HOA board." Karen stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus could see her calculating, trying to find some angle she'd missed, some lever she could still pull. Finally, her shoulders sagged. "What happens now?" "Then you face whatever consequences the law requires for the things you've done. And if I don't withdraw, if I fight this..." Marcus thought about his pool, about the 20,000 gallons of water he'd watched cascade down his driveway on that first morning of his rebellion. Dignity. Karen gathered her papers and stood up with the careful movements of someone who'd aged years in the span of a conversation. "I thought you were just another neighbor I could intimidate into compliance. But you surprised me. You fought back cleverly." She paused at the kitchen doorway. "But this turning the entire neighborhood against me, bringing in state investigators, destroying everything I built here, this isn't clever anymore. This is cruel." Marcus considered her words for a moment. "Karen, do you know how many families moved away from Willowbrook Estates because of your leadership? How many people gave up on home improvement projects they'd saved for years to afford? How many neighbors stopped talking to each other because they were afraid of being reported to the HOA for violations?" He stood up and followed her toward the front door. "You didn't build anything here except fear. We're not destroying your community, we're reclaiming it from you." Karen left without another word, and Marcus watched through his front window. As she walked slowly back to her house, her perfect posture finally showing the weight of everything that was about to fall on her. The voting lasted until 8 p.m. By 8:30, the results were clear. David Henderson had won the board presidency with 73% of the vote. Susan Martinez and Dr. Patricia Wells had captured the other 2 open seats by similar margins. Karen Whitfield, running for re-election to maintain her position as board chair, had received 31 votes out of 247 cast. The victory party was held around Marcus's fire pit, naturally. 43 people crowded into his backyard, including several neighbors who'd never attended the Friday night gatherings but had voted for reform anyway. The mood was celebratory but also quietly triumphant, the satisfaction of a community that had reclaimed its own governance. "So what's first on the agenda for the new board?" someone called out from the circle around the flames. David Henderson, still wearing his Henderson for Transparency campaign button, raised his beer. "First item is a complete financial audit conducted by an independent firm. Second item is implementing the transparency requirements from the State Homeowner Protection Act. Third item is a formal apology to every resident who was retaliated against for questioning board decisions. And fourth," Susan Martinez added with a grin, "is officially designating Marcus's Fire Pit as the new location for monthly board meetings. Much better atmosphere than that sterile community center." The laughter and applause that followed felt like the sound of a neighborhood finally exhaling after holding its breath for years. As the evening wound down and neighbors began heading home, Marcus found himself alone by the fire pit with Sarah Chen. "You know," she said, watching the flames dance, "against the October night, I moved here because I wanted a quiet suburban life. No drama, no conflict, just a nice place to raise my kids." "Did you get what you wanted?" Marcus asked. "Not even close. But I got something better. I got a community that fights for what's right instead of just accepting what's convenient." She stood up to leave, then paused. "Karen was wrong about one thing, though. What you did wasn't cruel. There's a difference, even when the person on the receiving end can't see it." Their formal inquiry into the HOA's financial irregularities. Next week, the new board would implement reforms that would prevent another